Yes. My father actually was an architect, so it's always nice to be back here. And I have a certain sympathy there for what you're doing. And I also remember, not least through his experiences, the 1970s and the 1980s crashes and how tough it is as an area. So, I got one of these, very good. Right, so I'll tell you a bit. Partly, I should say, the Behavioural Insight team, as you gather, was created inside British government. But actually, it was designed very much as a disruptive unit. It was deliberately built to be so. So I thought I'd try and just give you a bit of a glimpse into our world and maybe some practical things which you might find useful. After all, most of what we're trying to do in the world normally affects human behaviour. And I'll very much pick up also on this issue around different kinds of innovation. Actually, just to almost pick up where Sam had left off, one of the graphs we sometimes would look at in productivity in the policy world as an analogy was lighting. If you if you build a log over 100 years of how many pounds or pennies it takes to create a lumen, it's literally a logarithmic straight line. It's an extraordinary increase, an example of productivity, which the most recent, of course, is LED. But what's fascinating is when you zoom in on that almost perfectly straight line of improvement, logarithmic improvement, as I said, it's actually lots of little disruptions. So what's fascinating, as you just heard a moment ago, like Kodak and so on, is that companies get stuck, as do people. They get stuck because of their physical capital, but also their mental capital means that they're sort of used to doing what they did yesterday. And so, as in Christensen's work at Harvard that was sort of referenced, it's the external, it's the small player, the disruptor, the Dyson, that normally comes in and actually creates the next curve. So underneath this long line is lots of little S-curves, which are new technologies or innovators coming in. Of course, it might be hard to do that when you're in the middle of it all, but that's a big story. Oops. Okay, I realize we actually have the old slides rather than the new slides, but it doesn't matter. I'll go with it. Never mind. So if actually illustrate the kind of the general story around light. What's nudging all about, or behavioural science? Here's an old-fashioned example from an innovation from 100 years ago when newfangled automobiles were shooting around. And somebody had the bright idea, actually instantly where it came from, to put a line down the road. Actually, this is one of the very early examples, 1919 in the US, 4 years before it came to the UK. And someone actually was following a milk truck which was leaking, which gave them the idea, actually, leaving this trail down the middle of a road. So this is Dead Man's Corner, where these newfangled automobiles kept hitting each other. And so just painting this line down the middle of the road, and actually you can see that hand-painted arrow, turned out to be a great innovation. It is actually an everyday bit of genius, if you think about it, to put these markings on the road. And for most of us looking around them, when you learn to drive, like me, you learn the highway code. It was just a code. It's actually not mostly in law. It's just advisory. It's a good idea. You might want to drive on this side versus the other. It's an everyday kind of element of genius to create these signals that affect your behavior. And you could have bigger fines and regulations and telling you have to do the following thing, but actually it works through almost kind of patterning of self-regulated behavior and this guidance. So in 2010, the coalition government had a kind of problem, had a disruptive problem, if you like, in as far as the government didn't have much money, and also it didn't generally want to regulate and pass laws. So it was centre-right. And so it had this phrasing in the coalition agreement: a government will find intelligent ways to encourage, support, and enable people to make better choices for themselves. And so what would that mean? So that's an issue where, if you think about our big government departments, you've taken away their two primary tools. That's what they're used to doing, spending more money to fix things or arguing to get the next piece of legislation through, and you're told you can't do those things. So the BIT was created in number 10 literally to be a skunk work or guerrilla operation, actually, deliberately to disrupt, introduce new ways of thinking. So I'll just give you some glimpses. I actually, since these aren't the slides I thought I was going to give, it'd be interesting to see which ones we have got. That's all right. Here's an example then. Here we go. Disruptive in action. Sort of our classic early results, which was, could we get people to pay their taxes faster or on time? So an interesting general phenomenon, actually, is that we all overestimate bad behavior in everyone else. So interesting. We overestimate the number of people who don't pay their taxes on time or who take a sickie off work and so on and so on. Interestingly, we don't overestimate good behavior in our fellow humans, but we do overestimate bad behavior. So that potentially gives us a lever. So our hypothesis was, this is actually an already simplified tax letter for people who are late paying their self-assessment. It was just a block of 600 million for government. And we have one line, which I'll just pull out there. It just says something that's true. 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time. So the question was, if you added one little line like this, would people pay their tax faster? Well, let's have a look. So there's that control, a simplified letter. And this is the number of people who pay within 23 days. Why are we using that? Because that's what HMRC already gather as their data. So we add this one line. Actually, it turns out people do pay a little bit faster. Now, pulling it up 1 or 2% might not seem a lot to you, but if you're HMRC and you're in the business of collecting literally billions of tax revenue, this is worth a great deal of money. Actually, you're particularly attuned to people who are like you. So if you say most people in your area, so I live in Cambridge, I would have received a letter in principle saying most people in Cambridge pay their tax on time. Actually, that's even better. If you flip it around and you say, Sam, you are one of the few people yet to pay your tax on time, well, that's even better. And if we say most people in your area pay their tax on time, you're one of the few yet to do so, well, now we're at a 5 percentage point increase, or a 15% actually uplift in other terms. And what did it cost? It cost 1 line extra on the letter. So when the Behavioural Insight team was set up, it actually was set up with a sunset clause, unusually for government, because everybody thought it was probably not going to work. So the default was it would shut down in 2 years unless the Prime Minister made an overt decision to carry on going with it. But actually, it turned out it worked pretty well, and the PM decided to expand it, and BIT has actually doubled more than doubled every 2 years since 2010. So it brought in lots of money. Now, as it happens, I just said, actually, my father was an architect, and I was always interested in design, so I thought I'd just duck back to some of that work. I did my PhD many years ago on mental health and the built environment. Actually, I was going to become an architect, is the truth. And the reason I didn't, mainly, is it bugged me that it wasn't very empirical. I'm more like an engineer, you see. I thought, it was Venturi and so on and so on. Could we be more empirical and figure out, actually, how physical design affects behavior? Anyway, it turns out it does. I worked actually, for example, on a number of estates. This is a Radburn layout, you might realize or recognize, designed to be very safe so that you can bring your cars around the back and you have all this green space in the front. But actually, this is physically as a nice estate, but it was characterized by really high levels of anomie, right? And people didn't talk to each other and so on. So it was a nice natural experiment, which was that, you might remember at the time, it was sort of fashionable, Coleman and others, closing off walkways and things. So I don't know if I can use the laser for a second. So you can look like one of these sort of long courtyards here or whatever. So there's the cars going around the back, and all this. And here's a kind of long internal courtyard, but no one walks there. And one of the things is that there's this phenomenon, which is true in firms too, which is that it's something called the economics of bad neighbouring. So if there's someone out there you don't really like, or particularly lots of people could be crossing through this estate, and if there's someone in the space, are they a neighbour or are they a stranger? And you don't really know. But if you start closing off even small numbers of the sort of alleyways that link through, it becomes much more likely that someone in that space is one of your neighbours. And it leads to a kind of domino consequence. So we're able to, what happened is just some of the closes were changed and some were not. And then you could see the changing patterns over 2 years of increased sociability, reduce depression and anxiety on clinical scales. And it was a really substantial effect, actually. It was quite dramatic. So it is possible to do it. I'll show you one more, actually. I think one more. I'm not sure which I've got. But this is actually from an everyday experiment, which is students get randomly assigned often to their accommodation. So here's a contrast between two different types of student accommodation. And the question is, does it make a difference to your behavior? The answer is it does, actually. So this is a kind of classic double-loaded corridor that many of you will remember fondly from your student days. I certainly had accommodation like this. It's very efficient in design terms, actually, because all the bathrooms are together, etc. This is US, so actually people often are sharing rooms as well. But it's pretty unlikely that everybody is going to go to the bathroom at exactly the same moment, in a student population anyway. And so it's pretty efficient to bring your services together and so on. Contrast that with a suite design. So here you've got groups of 3 bedrooms around 1 bathroom. Now it's pretty likely that one of your kind of student colleagues are going to be in the bathroom when you need it. It's kind of inherently actually less efficient. Still, what's the behavioural consequence of these different designs? It turns out there's quite a lot. And in the great tradition, actually, of psychology experiments, not only do they look at the behaviour in this context, but also in another setting. So people in the suite design are much less likely to stay friends at the end of the year. In the corridor design than in the suite design, right? They tend to fall out, they tend to go off somewhere else, whereas these guys tend to stay friends. It turns out, actually, academically, these guys do slightly worse as well, which is really interesting. Good excuse if you want an extra one. But what's really amazing is that the behaviour generalised to other settings. So I said psychologists like to do experiments in waiting rooms, if you know this. So you turn up some other part of the university and you're told, can you take part in this experiment or whatever? But the experiment is already happening in the waiting room. And what you find is that people from the corridor design sit significantly further away from each other than the ones from this design. They also avoid eye contact more, and when they engage in an actual exercise, they're more aggressive and conflictual in this context and this context. So what's happening? Well, actually, if you think about it, in a situation like this, there's probably 40 to 60 people who you might have on this corridor. The chances are at least one or two of them you're really going to dislike, right? Just odds on. So you adopt a pattern of avoidance. It's like being on the underground. It's not pushing people together doesn't make them all get on well. It actually just means you have this incredible skill to not look at anyone else in the face despite being so close. So what happens is other people become aversive, you learn to avoid them, and that's being driven by this design versus this design. So anyway, it's taking a bit too long on it, but actually I think it is really interesting that you can use behavioural science and apply it to design and architectural problems in really quite powerful and interesting ways, and I would encourage the profession in general to do so. Okay, so you could do it in that kind of ways, but you might just use our stuff more prosaically. So you just need your clients to pay their bills just like HMRC. So here's an example, very simple. This is actually from work we do in the US now, a city, and it was getting people late paying their bills. What's the difference? Well, simple stuff. Be really clear about what you're saying. Actually, it's got some rudimentary stuff like pay now, because that's the action we want someone to do. And then we also say, well, what about the envelope? When you do something on the envelope, well, actually, if you write on the envelope, Anne, you really need to answer this or open this, would it make a difference? So we run this as a randomized controlled trial, and we see for a small city in the US, does it make a difference? Yeah, oh dear, got mangled. Anyway, it more than doubles. This is about 20-something%, and this is more than 50% who pay when they get the modestly changed letter with the envelope written on the outside. So you can use it in these small ways too. There are also bigger sweeps to this. So one thing I think I would certainly think about, both if I was RIBA, I was running it, versus a small practice, which is what kind of feedback, why does feedback change a market? So we also use behavioural science in a bigger way. So let me just give you another example to sort of feed into this before I make a more general point. So imagine you're in some other country and you're trying to decide where to go and eat this evening, right? And you look at some restaurants and try to make a judgment about it. Well, you might well look at, some feedback platform. And in the US, for example, there's Yelp, particularly used. And what do we find? So it's been incredibly carefully studied, the impact of sort of feedback in a market. So we can actually causally show what it's worth to have 1 star extra on a 5-star rating on a restaurant's growth. It's actually worth about 7% extra growth in the year following, causally, to have 1 star extra on a 5-star rating. Yeah? What's really, really interesting, I think, is that it doesn't actually affect the market share or growth of the big companies, but it has a big impact on the small companies. And you can see why that is if you think about the restaurant example. So, are you going to go to Pizza Hut or whatever? Well, you kind of know what you're going to get. You're not really going to be affected by the ratings, right? You kind of know what you're going to get. If you go to the small independent, actually you're now not so sure. Would you take a chance? Well, you would do if it gets better feedback, right? So we find that disproportionate impact on growth is all focused on the small players, the independent players. Now, one of the fascinating things about service industries in the UK and elsewhere is it's very hard to get that good feedback. So you'd hope some of your clients do, but what I'm saying to you is that actually it's generally very shrouded. So if you can introduce more information into the market, better feedback about who's good and who's not, who perform well, it disproportionately drives the growth of smaller players and, of course, your most innovative. It basically is catalyzing what you heard earlier, right? Because suddenly the small innovative companies are able to differentiate properly. So I would press pretty hard if I was running the RIBA to say, and indeed other service industries, and I was a small player, can we improve that market feedback information? And it will disproportionately boost it. So we've shown that also true in relation to government feedback. SMEs are also less likely to receive negative reviews, etc., and get top reviews. So be the business, one of the key issues I need to try and draw to a conclusion, really, is on productivity. There's these two forms of disruption. One is the kind of marginal. There are lots of ways in which you can try and tune in and say, could you be more productive? You can use behavioural science to manage your people better. What's the best way of giving incentives? Is it financial incentives? Generally not, actually. Other forms of incentives are much, much more effective. You can use it in your small practice, and you might be able to use it in some more dramatic design examples too. So what's some of my feedback or conclusions? Well, SMEs do have the particular power to drive innovation. We heard that already. I think actually you can go further, the last point really, about increasing the feedback in the market disproportionately benefits SMEs. I would definitely want to do that. I would definitely want to seek evidence. So a part of the story is really about so-called marginal innovation, marginal gains. It's a story about small disruptions actually are pretty powerful inside a small experiment. But also let's not forget actually what you heard earlier, which is about disruptive innovations. Two forms of innovation. One's marginal, lots of small improvements. The other is disruptive. And that is ultimately what SMEs have the biggest advantage of, right? You don't have the same mental fixation as many other larger firms will have, and it enables you to see potentially new kinds of solutions. So I'll stop there. You can read about our stuff. We publish, Behavioural Insights team, his latest set of results, or you can read, a lot cheaper than hiring us, read a book about what we do. So I'll stop there. Thank you.